Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Makkot Daf Zayin. Today's stuff is sponsored anonymously for a full shlema of Mia Bat Yonina, for the safety of our soldiers and for the safe return of the hostages. Okay, we're going to get started. We're going to finish the first chapter, and you're going to see that the first chapter kind of creates an end to Masechet Sanhedrin. You could sort of see, okay, even though kind of said, right, Sanhedrin and Makkot were split specifically before the beginning of our chapter, but this sort of ends a unit, and that's why if you look at it just in the context of Makkot, it doesn't really make sense that we're doing this. But if you view it as if the first chapter of Makkot was really a continuation of the last chapter, again, not Paraklelik, the last chapter in the Mishnah of Sanhedrin, which was Elohein and Echnakim, and from there we got into a tangent about Edim Zomimim. This sort of closes up everything about Dine Retzach, okay, murder cases, or anyone who gets killed by capital crimes, I should say, kind of finishes up capital crimes, and we end up with this Mishnah sort of talking about general court rulings or rules, I would say, general court rules relating to capital crimes. And that's why this really seems to be the end. And then we're going to start Elohein Golin and Elohein Elokim, who gets exiled to the refuge city, which is not a capital crime. And again, it had to do with murder, but not intentional murder, and therefore not a capital crime. And from there, we're going to get into who gets lashes, for what punishments you get lashes in the last chapter of Ramesechet. So before we get there, we have one last thing, but it actually fits the criteria because now we're talking about relatives and what relatives are not accepted in court. So it kind of fits with that as well. We got to it because if you remember in the last mission, even though we were talking about Edim Zamimim, we then got off by saying, well, al pishnayim edim, you can darshan it some other way, which is by the peh, by the mouth of the edim, the judges can't listen through a translator. And from there, we ended with this case of Rava, who people came who didn't speak his language, and then he put a Torgamon, and how did he do that? And then the Gemara explained it. So now we're going to have a different, sort of on a tangent from there, starting at the top of our daf. Ila v'Tuvia kreve da'ar v'have. Okay, these two guys, Ila and Tuvia, were relatives of the Arev, of the guarantor of a loan. Savar, and they came to testify about the loan itself. Now, who's the court case between? The borrower and the lender, not the guarantor. So Savar, Papa the Maimar, Gabe Love Umave Rechikeninu. Well, we'll accept these witnesses because they might be relatives of the guarantor, but they're not relatives of the Malva and the Love, the borrower and the creditor. So Amarle Rav Huna Bar Rav Yeshua Rav Papa. He says, how could you possibly accept them? If the love doesn't have money, who are they going to go to? They're going to collect the loan from the guarantor. So of course, right, these people have a vested interest, right? Again, we assume that relatives want to help their own relatives, then they're not going to be believed in court because in the end, it's true the case isn't right now between the guarantor and the creditor, but it could turn into that. And therefore, we're not going to accept their testimony. From that, we're going to start the next Mishnah now. Misha nigmar dino ubarach. So this is why I said I wanted to preface it because this Mishnah sort of doesn't relate at all to Edim Zomimim. Misha nigmar dino ubarach uba lefnei oto beitin ein sotrim et dino. Somebody nigmar dino, he was convicted of murder in the court. Okay, for whatever reason, he could be a murderer, he could be whatever it was, but he was convicted to capital punishment, and then he ran away, or she ran away. Uba lifnei oto beitin. And then the person who runs away, the convict, gets caught, brought back to the same court. Ein sotrim et dino. Now, this means they don't contradict their judgment, but that's not really what it means. If you remember way back, and this is why I said this kind of closes something we began in the beginning of Masechet Sanhedrin, where we learned that no matter what, they always try in capital crimes to find a reason to exonerate the person. We'd rather not kill them if we can avoid it. So, if there's some reason to say this person isn't guilty. So the question is, do they have to reopen the case and hear everything from the beginning now? Because maybe this time they'll find a way to exonerate the person. So they say no. If it comes before the same court, now the Gemara is going to infer from here that if it comes for a different court, it sounds like you will reopen the case. Okay? So we'll get to there. But if you come before the same court that already convicted them, they don't need to reopen the case. They just kill the person. Call makom sham dushnayim v'yombru. Any place where two people come to court and say, "Midim anu b'ish ploni shenigmar dino bebeitin shel ploni." We testify. This is different. This isn't the court caught him. This is two people see this guy in the town, and they say, "You know what? We heard that he was convicted in a different court. We were there. We heard him be convicted. We know he was. They come to the court and they say, right? Nigamar, do you know this person was already convicted somewhere else? Uploni edav, and they have to say who the names of the witnesses are. Commentaries say they even have to say, and they testified that the murder happened or whatever crime happened on this and this day at this and this hour, because testimony comes to court always has to have a potential that you can be mizin, right? That you can say this is wrong. So they have to give all the details. And if they do, then based on this testimony of two witnesses that claim that this person was already convicted in court, then they can rule that the person gets killed. Sanhedrin nohega ba'aretz u'b'chutz ha'aretz. Okay, like I said, it's just a list of a bunch of different cases. The Sanhedrin of 23 that is allowed to do murder cases, capital crimes, is in Israel. You can also have those courts outside of Israel. Okay, now the commentaries say only if they were rabbis who had smicha, because only if you have smicha, and that only happened in Israel. So it would have to be the judges came from Israel and already had smicha, but they have jurisdiction to rule on capital crimes even outside of Israel. Even though if you remember, toward the end of the Second Temple period, they already abolished all of capital punishment. Sanhedrin, now here comes the famous Mishnah that we've been waiting for all this time. Okay, this I've made mention of a number of times, and this really shows how much they try to avoid capital punishment. But we are going to see a range of opinions. Sanhedrin ha'oreget echad b'shavua nikra chovlanit. You're considered, I'm trying to think of the exact translation of chovlanit, but a violent court. Okay, like lachvol is to injure people. Okay, so it's not a destructive. That's a good word. Thank you. A destructive court. If you kill once, now shavua is a tricky word. Shavua in modern Hebrew means a week, but what they really mean, shavua in the Mishnah usually means a cycle of 7 years. Once in every 7 years is considered a chovlanit court. Rabbi Elazar ben Azar Yomer chal shavim shana. He says once every 70 years. Okay, you shouldn't even kill once every 70 years. Gemara is going to ask, does he mean you shouldn't kill at all? Right? Even once every 70 years, or does he mean once every 70 years would be a good amount of time to kill people? Okay, to once in a while have it once every 70 years. The Gemara is actually not going to know the answer to that question. But I'm going to come back to this in a minute. I'm going to keep reading the opinions and then I want to go back to this. Rabbi Tarfa Rabbi Kiva Omrim Ilu Ayinu b'Sanhedrin Lo Ne'erag Adam Me'olam. If we were in the Sanhedrin, now they were, but they mean if we were in the Sanhedrin at the time when there was capital punishment, we would never ever kill a person. Okay, how they do this? The Gemara is going to ask. So what would you do? I mean, what if there's witnesses, there's warning, the person accepted the warning, they killed anyway? How are you going to avoid it? We'll get back to that. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Afhem Rabbi Shochet Damim B'Yisrael. How could you possibly say you would never kill anyone? If we understand you don't want to kill people because you don't like to be shofech dam, right? But they're murderers, and if you don't kill them, there's going to be no deterrent for people not to kill other people if they know they won't get the death penalty anyway. Basically, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is saying the death penalty is a deterrent. So yes, we have to use it. Okay, and here you have your range of opinions: once a week. I'm sorry, once every 7 years, once every 70 years, or maybe he doesn't even mean it all, maybe never in your lifetime. And never at all. Okay, so maybe they're agreeing with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, depending on how you understand him. We don't have a lot of time, but I really want to go into this because I think it's really interesting. I was actually preparing this daf on the night before the Seder. And then, of course, what did I start thinking about? Elazar ben Azariah, the Seder says, Harayani kiven shivim shana. And if you remember, I went back and I said, I remember we had this in Sanhedrin also, in Parak Chelet. Another reference of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah having to do with the 70 years. So remember, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I am like 70. And then what does he continue to say? And I still haven't heard I still didn't find any source not for the fact that we have to remember to say we have to remember the Exodus from Egypt every night, which basically we do in Kriyat Shema, until Ben Zoma came along and gave a drasha. And the Gemara, if you remember, so this is the last mission in the first parak of Brachot. In the fourth parak of Brachot, when they retell the story, or they tell the story of when Rabban Gamliel got kicked out of the Beit Midrash, and they brought in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and he was 18 years old, and they put him to be the leader, which is right. Everyone was going to look at this 18-year-old, and a miracle happened, and he grew a beard. He got 18 white hairs in his beard, and he looked already older. And the Bavli says, okay, and I want to specifically tell you, the Bavli says this, that he said in that statement, he said in the end of the Mishnah, in the first chapter, Harani Kivin Shanim, Shavim Shana was said then because he says, I am like 70 years old. What do you mean I was like 70 years? I look like I was 70 even though I was only 18. And they connect those two things. Now, it's a very weird connection because it doesn't make any sense in the context of that. He was 18. And he said, I look like I'm 70 and I never heard this halacha until Ben Zoma came along. So I started looking it up a little more. And the Yerushalmi says, actually there, that he was 70 or was around 70. And it was a real statement of, I'm almost 70 and I never heard this until Ben Zoma came along, which makes a lot more sense. It's much more logical reading. Oh. Yeah. We also saw in Perek Chelek that, so then I thought to myself, this is interesting because he says here, once every 70 years. And in Perek Chelek, if you remember in this machloket about how long are Yemot Mashiach going to be, the days of the Mashiach, how long will they last? He also says 70 years. And 70 in general in the Gemara is a lifespan of a person. In general, their lifespan was 70 years, and they talk about the lifespan, it comes up in Psukim also, the lifespan is 70 years. And basically, I think that what Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah is saying in all of these statements is that 70 years is a lifespan. And therefore, once in 70 years means you shouldn't even kill once in the lifespan of, you being a judge. And 70 years is Yemot Mashiach. And Harani Kiven Shemim Shana, I've almost lived my whole life. I'm nearing the age where I might die, and I never heard this halacha until Ben Zoma came along. So I think that there's a connection there, and there's what to be thought about in terms of the connection of all these three statements of Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. Okay, moving on. Otherwise, we'll never get through the top. Okay, comes the Gemara and now says, Lifnei oto beitin hudein sotrin, ha lifnei beitin acher sotrin. Now, what does it say here? If you come in front of another, in the same court, then you can't reopen the judgment. But it sounds like if you come in front of a different court, you can. But Hatane Seifa, but that seems to go against the Seifa, because the continuation of the Mishnah says, Kol makom she'amdu shnayim v'yomu mi'edim anu et ish ploni shenigmar neo bebeitim ploni adav harei ze neharag. Now this is obviously a different court, and what do? They basically go on the testimony of the two witnesses, and they don't call the original witnesses and reopen the case and try to exonerate the person. So from the first line, you can infer, again, it doesn't say so, but you can infer that you do have to open the case again. From the second line, it sounds like you don't open the case in a different court. So Amar Abai lo kasha kam be'eretz Yisrael kam b'chutz la'aretz. Abai comes, it says it depends whether you're in Israel or outside of Israel. And we're going to explain this in a minute based on a braita, explain a little more detail than Abai says, which is Tanya, as it says in a braita, Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai Omer B'Shum Rabbi Shimon ben Shattach, Barach me'eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz, Barach me'aretz l'chutz la'aretz, ein sotrim et dino. So comes Rabbi Yehuda ben Tostai in the name of Rabbi Shimon Shattach and explains it. And this then is basically what Abai says to resolve the contradiction in our Mishnah based on what he said. He wasn't talking about our Mishnah specifically, but he was saying the same idea. If someone runs away from a court in Israel and runs abroad to a different court, then you don't reopen the case. Why? Because there's just superiority to the courts in Israel. So obviously, if he was convicted in Israel, we're not going to reopen the case. They must have tried to find any way they could to exonerate. So we don't reopen the case in Chutz La'aretz. But if it was done in Chutz La'aretz and then they came to Israel and the person ran away and then is brought to a court in Israel, then you reopen the case. And they say because of Zchutav Eretz Israel, they think that the Zchuyot, the merits of Israel, or probably what they really mean is they had greater respect for the rabbis of Israel. They basically would then reopen the case because they think that the rabbis in Israel will be able to hopefully find a way to exonerate this person. Again, this whole direction of we see two things here. Number one, trying to exonerate, and number two, the superiority of the rabbis in Israel, and the fact that even though the Mishnah says Sanhedrin noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, we already said the commentaries talked about that. Well, only if they had smicha from Israel, and also here, right, that there's a superiority of the court in Israel. So if it came from Israel, the first judgment, they're not going to reopen it. If it came from abroad, they are going to reopen it. But also what I wanted to point out is it's not just Israel abroad. It's if it was already judged in Israel and moved to a different place in Israel, you wouldn't reopen it. So it's not so simple the way Abai said Israel abroad. It really depends. Was it from abroad to Israel, or was it from Israel to abroad? And that will explain the contradiction between the Mishnah, because each one's talking about a different case. Sanhedrin nohega bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Now we're going to deal with that line. Minan and where do we get it from? Ditanu Rabbanan is a great example where they quote only part of the pasuk, and the important part of the pasuk they leave out, because again they assume you know all the pasukim by heart. V'hayu ela lachem l'chukat mishpat l'dorotechem. This happens to be in Bamidbar Lamed Hey, which is the chapter we're going to deal with a lot in the next chapter, which is the chapter. There's two chapters in the Torah, one in Bamidbar 35 and one in Devarim 19, which talk about the Ir Miklat. It talks about a murderer and if it's accidental or intentional, and what determines which one it is, and what determines whether or not you go to a refuge city. And there, where it's talking about get taken to the court, it then says these are the rules. Hukam mishpat. These are the rules for you. Lidorotechem, for generations. And the important part they didn't quote here, which is bechol mashvotechem, wherever you live, which sounds like right every time you say bechol mashvotechem, it means even outside of Israel. So they say, Lamanu l'sanedrin shenohega ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz. Now, obviously, if they're talking about capital crimes there, they're talking about the courts of 23. So from there must have been courts of 23, even outside of Israel. In kem matamud lomar, it should be, at least according to the way people fix this, b'chol sha'arecha, and this is a pasuk in Devarim, chapter 15 or 16, I think 16. Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chol sha'arecha. You should put up judges in all of your gates. Now, all of your gates is, it continues and it says, Asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha, that God gave you. That means the land of Israel. So how do we explain that? B'sharecha tamoshik batei dinim b'chol pelech u'pelech u'b'chol ir v'ir. Within your gates, you put courts within each general area, region, and also in every city. Okay, in other words, in Israel, you have a responsibility to set up both in the regional courts and ones in each city. Ubechutz la'aretz, so that's the bisharecha, shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha. But the pasuk that says is it will be a chukat mishpat l'dorotechem everywhere you are. Well, even in chutz la'aretz, bechutz la'aretz tamoshi b'chol pelech u'pelech v'yat tamoshi b'chol ir v'ir. You have to set up in each region, but not in each city. That's one version of the Gemara. Some people have text that you don't even need to set up, not in each region, not in each city. You don't actually have a commandment at all to set up courts, which actually makes more sense because Shoftim Shotrim is saying set up a court system, and that's in Israel. Outside of Israel, you can have a court, but there's no obligation to set up courts anywhere. You don't have an obligation. Okay, so either you have an obligation within regions or you don't have an obligation at all. When is your obligation? Well, when you need it. If there's a need, you set up a court. You don't have a need to make sure that there's courts in the areas where you're living. Sanhedrin ha'oreged. So now we ask the question about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, which according to my interpretation, there's a clear answer, which means he doesn't really think you should kill at all, because he's saying once in a lifespan of a judge, right? Person should never kill, which means he'll never kill. But the Gemara asks this question: does it mean once every 70 years, if you would execute a person once every 70 years, then you're called a destructive court? Or meaning you shouldn't even do that. Or maybe it's saying this is the way of the world, meaning you should do it once every 70 years. Now, that would be a normal thing. Like, do it just once every 70 years only. Teku. And the Gemara doesn't know the answer to that question, and it's left as a hanging question. Rabbi Tarfon Rabbi Kiva Omrim, Ilu Hayinu, right? If we were there, we would never execute anyone. So Hecheyava Avde. So how would they do that? How would they avoid executing people? Because again, you ask the witnesses questions, they answer the right answer, and the person should be convicted. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar de Amri Travayu, they both explained, Re'item trefa harag, shalem harag. They ask you like this. If I were to witness a murder, I can't tell you. Now, if you remember, we learned this. If a person is going to die within, let's say they have a disease they're going to die within the next 12 months, if somebody kills them, they're not liable to the death penalty. Now, how would I know that if I'm witnessing a murder? I have no idea. I don't even necessarily know the person who was murdered. And even if I do know them, I certainly don't know their medical records. So they ask the witnesses, remember, you have to get your bediko right and your chakiro and all that. You have to answer all the questions. You say, well, was the person who they killed a treifa or was he not a treifa? So usually they won't know the answer to that question. And then once they don't know the answer, you say, oh, we can't accept your testimony. You don't know. Amrav Ashi, Imtim Tzalom Shalem Hava. What if they say, we know the person was completely healthy? Dilma b'makom sayif nekev hava. Now this is, I don't know if you know, but when you shecht animals, right? This whole block kosher is like checking if there was a perforation in the lung, and there's all sorts of things they check after the animal is dead. Perhaps the animal was a treifa. Right? When we say treif means not kosher, but it doesn't mean not kosher because the animal's not kosher, or even that the shechita was done properly. Right? The shechita could be done properly, but if the animal was going to die within 12 months, this is a topic we're going to get to soon when we get to chulin, what is considered a treifa in an animal, if there was some sort of wound, then the animal's not kosher. And same thing with a person. But you can check certain things after death to see, was the animal sick or something. You can check with the person, but not if there could have been, let's say, right, the person was killed, stabbed, and it could be when they stabbed them, now you can't tell. Maybe there was a perforation inside right where they were stabbed, but you'd have no way of knowing that. So basically, we could come up with a way always, Rav Ashi is saying, where we don't know. Maybe there was some inner perforation, which would have made the person a treifa, which would mean that we have no way of killing anyone who killed that person, of executing someone who killed that person, because we just don't know. So that would be a good way. So now they ask another question. What if they say the person gets the death penalty? The witnesses, right, had tried to convict or had convicted someone that they were bo'el erva. So how would you avoid that? That's having sexual relations, right? It has irrelevant, this whole treifa thing. So what would you do there, right? Meaning a forbidden father with a daughter. Okay, and they testified. So by Varabadam Travayo, Reitam Kimikobish Foferet. So they say, did you see the man go into the woman's body like a brush goes into a tube, right? There's a euphemism or a way of saying it in Lashon Naki, as they call it. Okay. Did you see exact, right? Nobody can really see that. So they say, oh, that's such a good question. That's such a good way of avoiding it that they ask a better question, which is Rabbanan Hechadaine, the ones who disagree with Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Kiva. How would they ever judge cases? Nobody ever sees the acts of sexual relations to that detail. So they answer Kishmuel, the Amar Shmuel, B'na'afim, Yishayaru Kimena'afim. When you testify about people who committed adultery or inappropriate sexual relations, you testify that you saw them lying together the way people lie together when they have relations. You don't have to actually get into all the details, having seen exactly Kim Kobish Foferet. Okay, so with that we finish Hadran alach Ketzad Eidim. Finish the first chapter, and now we move to a fascinating topic of Eidim of Arei Miklat. Okay, the refuge cities. You're going to notice the first words of the Mishnah are Elu Hein Hagolim. These are the people that are exiled. Okay, this is an interesting thing in and of itself because in the Torah it calls them Arei Miklat. Arei Miklat are refuge cities. They provide refuge. Why do they provide refuge? They provide protection from the relatives who want to avenge the death of the person who died. So we basically have an accidental murder. Someone commits a murder by accident. We're going to see exactly what falls into accident. That's going to be a big topic, particularly of today and the continuation. Okay, because it has to be somewhere in the middle. Okay, what we call shkaga. I'm going to talk about in a minute why that is and what we're going to have karov la'ones and karov la'mezid, where you're not going to go to the refuge city. If it's close to ones, where it was really circumstances totally, completely beyond your control, or close to, right, we're going to have to put things on a scale. Where they go from karov la'ones all the way to mezid, which is intentional. If it was close to intentional, then you're not going to go to the refuge city either. So how does this work? Well, in the Torah, it calls it refuge city. On the other hand, if you look in the differences between Bamidbar and Dvarim, and if you want to delve into this more in depth, we have a course on our website called The Accidental Murder, which is a course designated, number one, to provide the opportunity to get more skills. It's a Chavruta-based class, which you can do online at your own pace, to basically like independent learning, to basically to be able to teach people how to have skills and how to learn Gemara independently, and also how to delve more in depth, which we don't get to do in Daf Yomi, right? So if you do daily study together with courses like that, where we have a number of them on the site, you can really, the combination of the two can help really propel your Gemara learning. So I highly recommend it. And particularly now, while we're learning the sugyot, it's a great opportunity to really delve into sugyot that we're learning in the Daf. So one of the things we talked about there is you can look at the psukim in Bamidbar and this psukim in Devarim, and there's a bit of a different emphasis in each one on a different element of the Yirmiklat. Because the Yirmiklat really has three elements to it. Number one, it's punishment. Now, the flip side of punishment is always atonement. Something that is a punishment often provides you with atonement. Okay, so that's first of all. So there's both punishment. On the other hand, you get atonement, which is a positive thing. Punishment is negative. The atonement element, we're going to call kapara, it's going to come up in the Gemara, is the atonement. In addition, you're getting the protection from the relatives. The relatives kill you. Okay, I always think of it like a big game of tag. Okay, if you're on base, you're in the Yermiklat, they're not allowed to kill you. But as soon as you get off base and you're outside the Yermiklat, they can kill you. We're going to get into what the borders of the city, what about around the city, which part, exactly where you have to be. Really is going to sound like a big game of tag. But anyway, we'll get there later. So now we're going to talk about this issue of karov la'onis, karov la'mezi, because since it has both positive and negative elements to it, where it's protection, if you close to intentional, you don't deserve the protection, and you also don't deserve the atonement. So you should get punished. We might not be able to punish you because we don't have all the evidence that it was intentional, but it's close to intentional that we're not going to provide you with all the benefits of the Irmiklat, the refuge city. And if you're close to honest, we're not going to make you go to the refuge city because it was so beyond your control that it really wasn't your fault at all. In other words, Irmiklat is something in the middle. You have to be in the middle, where we call it shkaga, okay, where we're going to say you, number one, weren't careful enough, you were negligent, so you deserve to be exiled and you have to leave your family. Well, some of your family comes with you, but you have to leave your home that you grew up in, your place of comfort. You have to go to some other city, and right, but then you get all the benefits that this provides you with atonement. Okay, I'll put up on the site, and I remember this great article in the New Yorker I mentioned last round, and I mentioned also in the course. I found it really interesting because this concept of a refuge city really doesn't come up in other religions much, and doesn't even come up in society much. And this article was talking about nonprofit that was created, or some, I forget exactly, I read it a while ago, but what I remember from it is it was basically talking about someone who decided, I need to take initiative and help people who have murdered people unintentionally, because it's a very hard thing. Unfortunately, now with the war, there's a lot of situations like this. And as we can see, right, it's very hard to go on with your life as normal after having something like this happen. And the Torah understood that and provides you with a punishment that sort of helps you to kind of like a therapeutic way of dealing with what happened and how you go back to your life. Like by taking you out of your city, it's actually very helpful to you to not be seeing all the same people who know you and everybody knows, oh, you killed someone accidentally. And you're with other people that are also struggling with the same issues. It's a very interesting psychological thing. And this article talks about it from a different perspective, right? Not a refuge city at all, but it was very interesting. So I'll put up a link to it, and I think it would be helpful for people to read to kind of, before learning all this, gives a bit of perspective on the whole thing. And again, it's very something unique that the Torah really talked about already way back when. This idea that I don't think people were aware of so much or thought about as much as the Torah did. It's very interesting. Okay. And that's why I think it's a very complex issue, because there's all sorts of elements to it, right? On the one hand, you were negligent. On the other hand, we don't want to blame you completely. We want to give you a way to cope with life after having done that. Elohena golim. Haoreg nefesh b'shgaga. Okay, that's obvious, right? Who goes to Ir Miklat? Someone who kills accidentally or unwittingly. So now we're going to have examples. Now, all these examples is someone standing on a roof, which makes sense because that's where things could happen. Okay, so you're standing on a roof, and we're going to have three cases times two. We're going to have the three versions, three cases. You do it this way. You're going to go to Ir Miklat. If you do the same action but a little differently, you're not going to go to Ir Miklat. And the main difference is going to be if you're doing something derech yirida or derech aliyah, which we'll talk about when we finish the Mishnah, what the difference is. Hayama agel b'magela. Their roofs were flat. On the other hand, they wanted the rain to go off the roof. So what would they do? They would plaster it. Okay, so imagine you're standing on the roof and you're plastering with this roller, and you're going in a downward motion because you're standing at the top of your roof and you're plastering in a downward motion. V'nafla alav, and your roller falls down, kills somebody down below. V'haragto. Hayama shalshel b'chavit. You're lowering down a bucket from the roof. V'nafla alav, and it falls on someone as you're lowering it. It snaps or something, or it drops, and you kill someone. Or haya yoreh b'sulam, or you're going down the ladder, presumably from the roof or the second floor. V'nafal alav, and you fall down on someone. Haragto hareze goleh. All those you go to the refuge city. But if you were standing on the roof and you were moving the roller up toward you, you were pulling it toward you, upward motion, and then it falls and kills someone. Or you're raising the barrel, and the rope snaps, and it kills a person. Or turning out on a bed, you're going up the ladder, and if you fall, the rung breaks and you fall on someone, you don't go to your miklat. Here's the rule. Now, you could have come up with the rule without it, and that's why later the Gemara is going to say, they always say this, whenever it says there's the rule, it must be coming to include another case. And in this case, it'll be two cases because they're saying two parts. If it's while you're in a downward motion, you go to the refuge city. If it's not in a downward motion, which basically means you're going in upward motion, then you don't go to the refuge city. Now, the general understanding, the Rambam talks about this. Gravity, as we know, he doesn't call it gravity, but he basically describes gravity in other words. Gravity is always pulling things down. So if you're doing something in a downward motion, you should have expected that something might, right? It might fall, it might go down, it might drop down. You should have been careful, making sure there's nobody there. And therefore, right, again, that means you were negligent enough to send you to the refuge city. Not terribly negligent because you didn't think the rope was going to break. You didn't think the roller was going to fall out of your hand. On the other hand, you were going in a downward motion. You should have been more careful. But if you're going in an upward motion against gravity, then it was less likely it was going to fall. Again, one can argue with this. It was less likely it was going to fall. And therefore, you're not going to go because we're going to call it karov la'ones. Now, we're going to see later on Daf Tet that there's an approach that maybe derech aliyah is karov lemezid. And this is going to be something that's going to follow us, especially throughout today's Daf, which is there's all these cases they're going to say you don't go to the refuge city, and it's not going to be clear, do you not go because it's karov la'ones, or do you not go because it's karov lemezid, which is the same law. You don't get exiled, but it's a very different situation. One is you don't need to, and the other is you're not deserving of it. We're not going to let you. And there's a really big, as we call nafkamina, practical difference, according to some of the commentaries, which is logical, which is what if when you're outside the city, because you can't go to the refuge city, the relative kills you. So if you're karov la'ones, then they're liable because they're not allowed to kill you. But if you're karov la'mezid and they kill you, again, there's different interpretations, but they won't necessarily get killed for it. Meaning it's like you don't get the protection and the protection's not there and you have to figure out a way to protect yourself, maybe hire a bodyguard or something, right? Because they really are allowed to kill you in a sense because you're not deserving of the protection of the Miklat. That's at least the way some of the commentaries understand it, which again makes sense in terms of this model. So there is a big nafkamina, and therefore it's even all the more so problematic that a bunch of these cases where they're going to say you don't go to Galut, we don't know for which reason, and that's going to have important ramifications. So the first question is where we get this derech yirida from, if that's the case, because it is a little arbitrary. So in describing the cases where you go to the Miklat, it says, okay, it's describing in this pasuk, it's Bamidbar Lamed Hey 23, if it was by a stone, below ra'ot that you didn't see, vayapel alav vayamot, you bring it, right, you kind of, so it's a little tricky. Vayapel, I was like, and you dropped it upon the person, okay? Or vayapel is a little more, it's a little more forceful than just you dropped it. But we're going to go with the root is from nafal, fell, and therefore we're going to say that's the case where you're going to be liable, because that's what the Torah is saying. In those cases, you're going to go to the refuge city. So ad shipol derech nefila would have to fall derech, by a downward motion. Tanu Rabbanan, Bishkaga, Prat Lemezid. Bivlidat, Prat Lemitkaven. Okay, these are two strange drashot. We'll see why in a minute. But the Torah says, okay, we should make for you Yarei Miklat, Yena Lachem, V'nas Shama Rotzeach Maken Nefesh Bishkaga. Okay, you should run there if you kill Bishkaga. Bishkaga comes to exclude intentional. I was going to say, obviously intentional. You don't go to the refuge city, you get the death penalty. Why is it teaching us this? Likewise with the next drasha. The next drasha is on a different pasuk, bivlidat. Hey, asher yakeh et re'eu bivlidat. you killed someone without knowing, so prat mitkaven, that means you didn't know you were killing, right? That goes again, as opposed to, it would exclude the case if you intended to kill, intentional manslaughter, right? Or intentional murder. So again, the Gemara is going to say for both of these, obviously, if you intended to kill, you're not going to be going to the refuge city. Obviously, if you were mazed, right, intentional murder. Okay, so what is this telling us? Mazid pshita bar katalahu. So first, they're starting with the first drasha. Shkaga prat lemezi. What do you mean? Mazid, you're high of the death penalty, right? You would get killed in court. Of course, you don't go to the refuge city. Amarava ema prat leomer mutal. Rava says this is to exclude someone who thought it was permitted to murder. This is a bit of a crazy case. Okay, Amar le Abaye, Yomer mutar anusu. So Rav is going to say, why don't you go to the refuge city? Because you thought it was permitted, and someone who thinks it's permitted to murder is obviously more on the side of mazid, intentional, right? Or like, because who doesn't know it's forbidden to murder? You can't claim I thought it was okay. So look, we're not going to convict you in court and give you the death penalty because you didn't know it was forbidden. Remember, you need to be warned, you need to know the ramifications. But we're not going to let you go to a refuge city. To which Abaye says, Iomer mutar anusu. Says, what do you mean? Someone who doesn't know it's forbidden is karov la'ones. You didn't even know it was wrong. Amar leis to Rav answers him, Shani Omer, Omer mutar karov le'mesid. He says, what do you mean? I think Omer mutar is karov le'mesid. Okay? I think it's intentional. Here we have a fascinating debate. And in fact, there was a geffen about this a while ago. I mentioned it. I taught Daf Tet in advance, and I mentioned I wasn't sure where it is, but I found it, and I actually put it back up on our site. It's right now in the Beyond the Daf content, and it's now linked to the staff, so you can find it. It's a shiur from Gefet that we had on Sanhedrin Daf Samach Bet about Omer Mutar, this Machloket Abaye and Rava. There's a whole section at the end of the shiur on specifically our sugya and a unique reading of our sugya. So definitely recommended to more in depth about this topic. It's a fascinating topic. What does it mean? I thought it was okay to murder. Right? How could that possibly? How could you think it's okay to murder? Where does that put you? And the fact that Abaye thinks that's anus is really fascinating. Hard to understand. But in any case, what does this connect to? Bishkaga prat Bishkaga prat lemizid comes to say you go to the Ir Miklat if you were negligent, but not right. Not if you thought it was okay to murder. That's not normally. By the way, Omer mutar. I didn't know it was forbidden to do a malacha on Shabbat. That's one of the options of shkaga, but not when it comes to murdering. He says because we're going to put you karov lemezid, which makes sense because why didn't you know? Abaye is really a strange shita where he says, what do you mean? You didn't know? That's really karov la'ones. Okay, so again, more in depth into that, you can listen to Gefet. Bivli dat prat mitkaven. So again, we're going to have the same question. Mitkaven pshita bar katalu. If you intended to murder, of course, you're going to be liable to the death penalty. Why would you even have to tell me that you're not going to go to the refuge city? Amarabba prat mitkaven la rogat habema varagat adam lekuti varag Israel v'nefa varag ben kayama. He brings three cases where you intended to kill someone or something that you wouldn't have been liable to the death penalty for, either an animal or a kuti, who you actually are liable in the hands of God, but not by a court of man. And if you killed a baby that wasn't a viable, a newborn baby that wasn't going to make it. Remember, they had those 8-month babies that they said are not going to make it. It was clear, or a very sick baby that was clear it's not going to make it. You thought you were killing that, and it turned out it was a ben kayama. Okay, I don't want to think about a case for why you were killing this fetus, but let's not go there, or a newborn baby. But we're basically talking about you thought that what you were intending to kill was not something that would have gotten you the death penalty. In the end, it was. Now, again, we understand it. So the pasuk is coming to teach us, well, you're not going to get the death penalty for that, but you're also not going to go to refuge city because, again, there was intent to murder something, kill something, and therefore you're going to be more on the side of more negligent than shkaga. Tanu Rabbanan, another braita. In befeta, okay, the Gemara describes other cases where there's a long description in these chapters about what the scenario is in which you would go to the refuge city and what scenario you would actually get the death penalty. If it happened unexpectedly, what does that come to exclude? Prat lekeren zavit. If you were turning a corner with a knife out and as you turn the corner, there was a person there, it's obviously your fault, right? You should have been paying more attention and not be holding a knife straight out and kill the person, so you're not going to go. Below eva prat lesoneh, exclude someone who you hate, which we're going to explain later, is someone who you didn't speak to for 3 days, okay, because you were angry with them. And then we assume, we're going to get into this more later, we assume there was intentionality here and it wasn't just negligence. Hadafo, now here, those two cases are excluding. Now we're going to have this word describes. Hadafo, shedachafo begufo, okay, oh hadafo. Hadafo, they're going to say means if you push them with your body, meaning, right, if you bumped into someone and knocked them over and killed them, then you'd be liable to go to the refuge city. Oh hishlich alav, or you threw upon him, lavi yirida shitzorach aliyah. This comes to include a case, and this is going to be the main topic for the continuation. If I was going down for the purposes of going up, remember we said derech yiridah chayav. This is if I kind of did a downward motion, but my whole intent in doing the downward motion was to get to an upward motion. And we're going to talk about a case of this coming up. Okay, you would actually be also liable to go. Okay, meaning as long as there's yiridah in there, some sort of downward movement, even if the intent is for the upward movement, you're down to get up, like to propel yourself higher, let's say, right? You push down to kind of get yourself higher, let's say like on a trampoline, all the more so, right? You go down to go up. Okay, that would be an extreme case. Then, since there's a downward motion there, and while you were doing the downward motion, you killed someone, you'll be liable to go to the refuge city. Below stia, again, we're just quoting words from Psukim here, without, these are all from the same Pasuk, without intent. So what does this come to exclude? If you were throwing something, let's say in one direction, and it went somehow the other way. So this is a good question. What do you hear? Commentaries are conflicted. Does this mean, well, you weren't even going in that direction, so the fact they went in that direction isn't your fault, and therefore we're going to put you karov low. And some people say, what do you mean? You were throwing something. You should have been more careful not to throw it, and maybe be aware that maybe a wind could come and blow it the other way, and therefore it's karov low. Mazid, and that's why you're not going. So here's where we start to get unclear. Vasher lo tzada, where you didn't intend. Again, it's another pasuk. Problem mitkaben lizrak shtayim v'zarak arba. This case we had in Bav Kama, if you remember. What happens if you did this on Shabbat? Were you chayav malacha? No, because malacha machshevet asrat Torah. If it was damages, you for sure be obligated because you're chayav in damages, even if it was by accident. And what about ir miklat? Well, if you intended to throw it 2 cubits and it accidentally went 4 cubits, so you don't go to the refuge city. Again, why? Here it sounds like you should have been more careful. You just have bad aim, and therefore maybe we're going to call you karov lemezid. When it describes this pasuk about one of the cases where you go to the Ir Miklat, and this is actually the classic case, it says Asher Yavot Re'eu Bayar. If you happened upon your friend in the forest. Now, forest is a place where everyone can go freely, right? It doesn't belong to anyone. So, Ma Yar Reshut Lanizaku Lamazikli Kanes L'Sham, Afko Reshut Lanizaku Lamazikli Kanes L'Sham. So the scene has to happen in a place where everyone had permission to be there, and not, let's say, the accidental murderer goes into someone's land, their property, they didn't have permission to be there, and accidentally killed the owner. Then, of course, you're not going to be able to go to the refuge city. It was your fault for trespassing. Okay, it would have to be a place where you go to the refuge city when you're both allowed to be there. There's a debate about what if you're both in someone else's property. What do we rule in that case? What if it's not like you went into someone's property and killed the owner? What if you went into someone's property and killed someone else who wasn't allowed to be there? There's a debate among the commentaries whether that case is included in this or not. Here comes the question. So that was all a brighto. Okay, these were brightot that we read from the beginning of the Gemara. We were reading brightot to basically give us, some perspective on which cases are in, which are out. Rabbi Yavahu asked Rabbi Yochanan, so I'm climbing a ladder, going up. Upward motion should be exempt. But as I step down, right, stepping down is a downward motion, then the rung falls, and then it kills someone. What's the case? So meaning when I push down is when it happened. Kia gavna aliyahi or yiridai. Do we call this aliyah because you're going up, or do we call it yiridah because your foot stepped down? Amar lek farnagat to be yiridah shitzorach aliyah. We already learned this in the Braita. Rabbi Yochanan says this is what we call yiridah tzorach aliyah. You're going down in order to go up, and we said since it happened while you're in a downward motion, you're actually obligated. However, Rabbi Yavahu is not convinced by this Braita. Rabbi Yavahu brings a problem from our Mishnah, Etive, Zaklal. It says in our Mishnah, remember, and then we said this has to include an additional case. Why else is it there, this ruling? When it says, if it's not derech yirida, you don't go, what could this be including if not our case? Not derech yirida, meaning, because you're doing it, you're yirida, but to go up, you're going to be exempt. You're not going to go to your miklat. So Rabbi Yochanan says back to it, what are you going to do with the words kosher b'derech yiridato? You do go to ir miklat la tuyemai. What's that going to include? Ella, so comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, you can explain the Mishnah like this. The Mishnah is not including your case. The Mishnah is including a case of a katsav, la tuye katsav, a butcher. So Hachanami, in other words, kosher b'derech yiridato must be including a katsav. Hachanami also, kosher lo b'derech yiridato doesn't go to galilus, also including a katsav. Hachinami la tuye katsav. What's this case of the katsav? Titania, well, it says in the Braita. Katsav shayam katsev. So we have a butcher. Now the butcher would go like this. Okay, imagine holding a cleaver in your hand, like at shoulder height, your shoulders outstretched, your arm is going up, and then you're going to basically you want to get some power into it. So what are you going to do? You're going to put the cleaver down, put it up, go back. Okay, you're going to go basically first in front of you down, pick it up to shoulder height again, behind you, and then back forward. Okay, so in that you have a number of motions. You have first yiridah lefanav, you're going to put it down in front of you. Then you're going to pick it up aliyah lachorav because you're heading backward. Then you're going to put it down behind you. Okay, this is the best way to explain this is tennis, right? Like you're doing a serve. You're going to put it back behind you, okay, to get more power. That's yiridah lachorav, behind you. And then you're going to pick it up again. That's aliyah shelefanav because you're going in a forward motion. And then you're going to do the yiridah shelefanav and actually cut the meat. So the way we're going to describe this, we're now going to have 4 braitas that all say different things. So about this katsav shayam katsev of the butcher, tanichada lefanav chayav lacharav patur. One says in front of you, you're chayav. If you're doing it behind you, you're exempt. Tanya idach, a different one says lacharav chayav lefanav patur, the exact opposite. Going backward, you're chayav. Going frontwards, you're patur. Tanya idach, a different one says bein lefanav bein lacharav chayav, whether it's before you or behind you, you're obligated. V'tanya idach bein lefanav bein lacharav patur. And the other one says it doesn't matter whether it's in front of you, going forward or going backward, you're going to be exempt. Okay, very super confusing. But lo kasha, there's no difficulty here. Tam b'yiridah, so now going one by one. Lefanav chayav acharav patur, in front of you, you're obligated. Going backward, you're exempt. Tam b'yiridah lefanav aliyah acharav. These are the first 2 motions. If you're doing the yiridah, you're going downward. Basically, it's very confusing, but it's very simple. Any downward motion, you're going to be obligated. Any upward motion, you're going to be exempt. Even though you could say the downward is to go up and the upward is to go down. Okay, but it all matters is what motion were you doing. And that's basically what Rabbi Yochanan's answering, because it's all about, right? What he's saying is, well, actually, it's a little different than what he's saying, but what he's saying is anything that's derech yiridato, okay, if the purpose of is down, it's going to be obligated. So, kam b'yiridah shelefanav aliyah shelacharav. So if you're going down, it's going to be obligated. If you're going up, backward, you're going to be patur. The next one, where it's at the opposite, was talking about the aliyah shelefanav. It's talking about if your hand is already back and you're picking it up going forward, then because you're going up, you're going to be exempt. Yiridah shelacharav, you're going back over, right? You're going in a backward motion, but you're going downward. You're going to be chayav. Tam b'yiridah shelefanav v'shelacharav. Okay, in the cases where you're going to be obligated in both is because you were going in a downward motion, whether forward or backward. And kam b'aliyah shelefanav v'shelacharav. And if you're going up, doesn't matter back or forth. Okay, so that is how he ends up reading the Mishnah. And then again, this really actually fits with Rabbi Yavau, that it's going to be whatever direction you, right? If you're doing up or down, it all just matters if it's up or down. The truth is, it's just a little confusing, and there's a bunch of different readings of how to read this section. Okay, but lema kitanai. Now they're going to suggest that this question that Rabbi Yavau asked Rabbi Yochanan is perhaps a Tanaitic debate. Haya ole besulam. Even though we saw a Braita before, maybe there's Braitas that disagree. Because listen, haya ole besulam v'nishmitash liba mitachtav. So you're going up the ladder and the bottom rung drops. Tanichada chayav v'tani idach patur. One says you're obligated, one says you're exempt. So again, you're going up, but you're going in a downward motion as it falls. So one says obligated, one says not. It sounds like what Rabbi Yochanan said. You're obviously obligated to go to Ir Miklat. Maybe it's a debate because one says you're exempt. So now we're going to say, "My labakami is this not the root of the machloket? Marsavar yirida, marsavar aliyah." One views this as yirida, like Rabbi Yochanan said, because in the end the motion was going down, and the other says, "No, it's aliyah because you're doing it for the purpose of aliyah." So we're going to rule it as aliyah. So they say no, and now we're going to have 3 different ways, and with that we'll finish for today's daf. Lo dekule alma aliyah v'lo kasha kan lenizakin kan legalut. Now they suggest that perhaps everyone disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan, and perhaps these Braito both disagree with the earlier Braita that said, Yiridah for the purposes of Aliyah is actually, since you're doing aliyah, you're going up, you're obligated. Okay? But now we're going to say, but nizakin, we don't care if you're shkaga. We don't care anything. You're no matter what, you're going to be obligated for nizakin kan legalut. In other words, if we view this as upward motion, we're going to call this karov laones. Karov laones, you're not going to be obligated to go to Ir Miklat, but you are going to be obligated if you cause damage on the way. Maybe they're both having to do with Ir Miklat. If it already rotted, then if it's rotting, then when you step on it, it actually moves down. Okay. Think about a ladder, when you put your foot down, you might be putting your foot down, but nothing moves down. But if it was already rotted, then you're actually pushing it down. And then you're going to be obligated because it's derek yirida. If it wasn't rotted, then no. And same thing with the next one. Was it rotted, but lo kasha you could have a ladder where the rung is very firmly on. And then again, there's no real downward motion. Or it was not so firmly on, and then you're actually pushing it down as you go down. If it killed on the way, then we're going to obligate you. If it didn't, right, we're going to exempt you. Okay, we'll stop here for today, and we'll start with the next mission tomorrow. Another classic case of your miklat. So what we really did today, we finished up, like I said, the issues of Sanhedrin, bunch of things just related to the courts and capital crimes. And from there, we got to the Ir Miklat, who go to the Ir Miklat. The main difference being, again, it has to be shkaga in the middle and not too much karov la'onis and not too much karov la'mezid. And then we did this derech yirida, derech aliyah distinction, plus a number of other distinctions. And like I said, there was a bit of a lack of clarity about the exemptions, whether they're actually karov lemezid or karov laonis. And we talked ramifications. What's the difference if we say that or that, particularly if the goel adam kills the murderer. With that, we finish for today. We'll continue this topic a lot more in the next few days. Wishing everyone moadim l'simcha and a good day.